Is Calvin Ridley or Christian Kirk the wide receiver that you want to draft in Jacksonville? That and so much more on today's episode of The Launchpad. JJ, start us off. Who are you drafting from the Jaguars?
Look, I think that you can actually go in both directions here. I don't mind where either goes per se. My projections straight up like Calvin Ridley more than Christian Kirk. I think he's fine enough where he goes. But I do think that we have to be realistic about the fact that when he suits up to play, when September hits, it's going to be almost 2 years since his last real football game. That's a little bit frightening. And then you look at Christian Kirk. I think Kirk, from a value perspective, where he gets drafted is the better pick between the two. But I can understand going either direction. But, I do a lot of work with market trends. I'm going to be bringing that up a lot on today's show, I'm sure, where I look at historical ADP and I look at how players perform based on that ADP. And, so how middle round wide receivers have done historically versus ADP expectation, I call it. So every single point in a draft has some sort of expectation based on a player's ADP. So let's say that Christian Kirk is going 60th overall. 60th overall wide receivers would be expected to score, let's say, this is just completely arbitrary, let's say 12 PPR points per game. And so historically, if a player gets 13 points per game, then he's playing 1 point above expectation. And so you can then look at trends based on based on what the market has said historically to sort of spot where there might be some value in those middle rounds, in those early rounds, in those late rounds. And one thing that's pretty interesting is with middle round wide receivers, we generally see, if you look at a career year for these guys, we usually see rookies, second year guys, and then fifth and sixth year guys do very, very well. Now, I know that a lot of people are like, why would fifth and sixth year guys do well? I think a lot of it is they're unsexy names. They're players who they've been around for a while, but they're still good enough to be middle round picks, right? They're still, very reliable wide receivers seemingly. And then also, fifth and sixth year when wide receivers might see a change of scenery where their rookie contracts are up. They might go to a different team. And then there's a lot more ambiguity. And what I found with my research is drafters don't like ambiguity. They don't like it when we don't have substance behind a player's past and they don't have a backbone. So, a lot of times that's why rookies are great values in redraft leagues, is because people don't like that those question marks surrounding those guys. And so fifth and sixth year guys do really, really well, which this led me to Christian Kirk last year, led me to Juju Smith-Schuster last year too, but a 50% hit rate, I'll take it, right? So Christian Kirk now in his sixth year, he had almost a 24% target share per game last season. He's going to play a lot in the slot with Zay Jones and Calvin Ridley on the perimeter. He's going to get softer coverage there, which I like. And they're probably going to run a lot of 3-wide sets just given the personnel they have on that team. I think we're all expecting a jump from Trevor Lawrence and from this offense in general. There's a lot of good trends also with the market where if you have multiple early-ish round pass catchers, that's good for an offense in terms of touchdowns per game in that season. So I like the Jags. I like the offense this year. And I think that Christian Kirk, given his price tag, is just a little bit more of a value than Calvin Ridley.
Agree with everything you said there. And it seems like right now everyone seems to kind of be saying Calvin Ridley is the ceiling pick, Christian Kirk is the floor pick. Do you kind of agree with that, or do you think that there is kind of an untapped ceiling? I mean, we saw Christian Kirk, like you said, drawing targets at an obscene rate last year, scored a lot of touchdowns, and even with Calvin Ridley there, he's probably still going to be on the field for close to 100% of the snaps. So do you think that Christian Kirk still has a ceiling, or is that capped now with Calvin Ridley there?
I think we often, as fantasy managers, sort of get the idea of floor and ceiling wrong a lot. We use it sort of as a crutch whenever we don't know what a situation is going to look like, and we don't know what the situation is going to look like for Calvin Ridley. So hypothetically speaking, sure, he has a better ceiling than Christian Kirk, but I think that downplays how good Christian Kirk is as a player. You don't get a 24% target share per game rate by being a bad wide receiver. It happens only to good players. And he was a good prospect coming out, obviously had some issues in Arizona at times, but, was able to get some volume in Arizona whenever he was there. And so, I think that, we often mislabel that and it can get us into trouble because we then think that a guy like Kirk is more of a floor play and not a stealing play. He can't be a league winner. But if you're looking at where these guys are being drafted, and if you look at ADP expectation and how these guys exceed ADP expectation, you'd be surprised by the kind of players that end up being more breakouts, based on that, than the guys who we think are these high ceiling players.
For the record, I knew that's how you were going to answer it. I just thought that that would be a really good thing to talk about right here because we do get it wrong all the time. I mean, just look back at 2021. Nobody wanted Deebo Samuel because he didn't possess a ceiling. They said he's, a low ceiling, high floor, boring player, not going to be on any. And it did take a few kind of wild instances to push him into that Deebo role, but he was a league winner that you ended up getting in the 8th or 9th round that year, and nobody wanted him because he didn't possess a ceiling. Well, he scored 21 points per game that year, so that ceiling did in fact exist. Alfredo, same question over to you, though. We're talking about Christian Kirk and Calvin Ridley here. Do you have a strong stance between the two? Who do you prefer?
Yeah, I don't have a super strong stance. I'll just be honest, right out of the gate here. I want to believe in Calvin Ridley because I love his talent. I think he's such a good player, and him being attached to Trevor Lawrence, it seems like a really good match. The Jaguars had a pretty high neutral pass rate last season. I expect that to continue with Doug Peterson. The thing is here, and just to kind of, JJ mentioned, looking at the ADPs and the values associated with those draft positions. I mean, even just from a more macro level, you take the 1,000-foot view and you look at, well, if Calvin Ridley's going in the 3rd round, who are the other players going around him? And I see guys like Breece Hall, Lamar Jackson. Even if I want to look at another wide receiver like Amari Cooper, who I think is a bit safer, those are guys I'd probably rather go with. And then you start to jump into, more so of fantasy theory and draft theory. What are you doing early on in drafts? And I tend to stay a little bit more risk averse in my first 3 rounds. And that's why I probably wouldn't lean towards a guy like Calvin Ridley. And, the whole thing is with his cost, the boom bust nature of this season, right? We talk about him not playing for 2 years and how good he could be or what a bust he could be, right? Like that is the pick that could literally make or break your fantasy team. You don't typically find there's one guy that could do that, but being drafted that early and having that kind of production or lack thereof could absolutely make or break your team. Whereas if I have to choose, I absolutely have to choose one of these guys, I'd go with Kirk in the 5th round, if I'm being honest. But I'm probably not drafting a lot of Jaguars this season. I think their offense is going to be good. I think the team as a whole is going to be good. But the cost feels inflated because everyone is kind of accounting for the Trevor Lawrence jump, but we really don't know where all those points are going to go to. So I'm just kind of letting it happen and seeing where the chips fall, but I don't know that I'm necessarily investing in a lot of Jaguars in my fantasy drafts.
Yeah, and a lot of times you see young quarterbacks really like hyper target and fixate on one player, and you didn't see that last year with Trevor Lawrence. I mean, he was dishing it to Zay Jones and Marvin Jones and getting Evan Ingram going at the end of the year. So I don't think there's going to be a clear-cut wide receiver one here. I think the interesting thing, though, again, going back to the floor and ceiling debate, if you look at so many projections on all different websites, many of them favor Christian Kirk. But then when you're looking at ADP, Calvin Ridley's the favorite there because I think people have kind of tricked themselves into thinking that he has a much higher ceiling. So I don't want to put words in either your mouth because I think we all kind of bounced around the question a little bit, but I personally prefer Christian Kirk, especially at cost, and I think that you guys kind of fall there as well. But the Jaguars' offense is going to be a tough to predict one this year. And Alfredo, at some point this offseason, we'll have to have Dr. Vig back on just so we can talk about the Jaguars' offense because it's going to be a fun one. YouTube.com/footballguys. That's where you can find all of our content. In addition to this show, you can find Alfredo on the Pretend GM. You can find Sigmund Bloom and Cecil on the Audible. You can find Sigmund on the couch, who actually, JJ, you were just there a couple of days ago talking about some boomer bust players, I believe was the topic. I don't know. We have so many shows coming out right now. It's hard to keep track, but great show. So definitely recommend checking that out. But anyway, let's get back into the meat of the show. We already talked about Calvin Ridley and Christian Kirk, and that is one of the more polarizing discussions of this offseason. But there is another one that is just as polarizing, and we're looking at the ADP between these two players on Underdog. One is going as wide receiver 32. One is going as wide receiver 33. They're going back-to-back in drafts. Alfredo, start us off here. Jaxon Smith-Njigba at wide receiver 32. Tyler Lockett at wide receiver 33. Who do you prefer?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm giving you a couple of stinkers here to start. I don't have a super strong opinion on this one either. This feels a lot like I have to be honest too, right? Like I'm not just going to spit out a hot take just to do it because the Seahawks offense, it feels a lot like the Jaguars where on paper it should be better if Geno Smith continues to play well, and they added Zach Charbonnet, they added JSN, they've added all these weapons, young offensive line gets better, but we really don't know where all these fantasy points are going to go to. And so if we're looking at these two guys individually, I think I kind of want to break it down this way. You look at Tyler Lockett, he had the 7th most snaps from the slot last year, and he looks like he'll be moving outside in 2023. Doesn't mean he won't be productive, but it's a relevant change. It's something that's going to be a little bit different that he hasn't done in years. Now, Lockett can play outside. He started his career out there, but over the last 5 seasons, he's been used in the slot anywhere from 41 to 69% of the time. Nice. But those 5 seasons in the slot were best of his career. Like he's been really good there. That's where he's made his money. And now Jaxon Smith-Njigba comes in, kind of takes over that role. And we saw that Geno was targeting Tyler Lockett from the slot so much last year, but I don't think that we've ever really had that big career sample size where we can say, yes, Geno typically targets the slot, or was he just out there looking for Tyler Lockett a lot, and was that his tendency? So I can't tell you one way or another. I do think that, we've seen rookie wide receivers be incredibly productive. Jaxon Smith-Njigba is very, very talented. There is a reasonable belief he could end up actually being the target leader on this team as a rookie. So I do like both guys. But if, gun to my head, I have to pick one of them, I'm more likely to bet on the guy who's just a little bit cheaper, and he's been a top 15 fantasy wide receiver each of the last 5 seasons. So, if I have to do it, at the cost, I'm going with Tyler Lockett. In reality, I think I'm more likely to stay hands off of Seahawks skill players and probably just target Geno Smith as one of my late round QBs. Sorry, JJ, I kind of took that from you.
I think that's a perfectly fine answer. And I mean, when you look at DK Metcalf as well, getting drafted right now as wide receiver 15, we are expecting Geno Smith to either have a hyper-funneled offense through just those 3 or to have a wildly productive season. I think one of these guys, whether it's DK Metcalf at wide receiver 15 or JSN or Tyler Lockett at 32 or 33, somebody's going to come up way short of their ADP. So, JJ, throwing the same question over to you, JSN or Lockett, do you have a strong stance between these two?
Yeah, look, one of the things that I think is really, really important is that underdog ADP is an outlier, just in terms of like the way that folks are drafting wide receivers, and in particular, how sharp people are in drafting. I mentioned the rookie wide receiver stuff earlier. That's based on my fantasy league data. It's basically home league data, that kind of stuff. Whereas we're getting sharper ADP from a place like Underdog. If you look at like expert rankings across the space, if you look at other platforms, you're seeing a much wider gap here, and you're seeing Tyler Lockett a lot higher than Jaxon Smith-Njigba, because from a projection standpoint, that's what happens whenever you start plugging this stuff in, is that Tyler Lockett looks a lot better than JSN does. But a lot of the market-related trends favor Jaxon Smith-Njigba. He's a rookie. Obviously, he's someone who has a great backbone as a prospect. These rookies are just generally really good bets in the middle rounds, not just because they exceed ADP expectation from a season-long perspective, but they're also better during the second half of the year generally, and that's when the fantasy playoffs hit. That's when these tournaments hit, and that's when it's most important. So I'm actually of the belief that, I've done a lot of research, especially this offseason. I'm going to be doing a show on this pretty soon, but, where I'm looking at the market and I'm looking at where players are drafted by team, and I'm finding trends based on how those teams then score in terms of touchdowns per game. And so if you get multiple top 36 wide receivers, let's say, and a top 12 tight end and a top 12 quarterback, all of that combined can tell you if a team's going to be good in terms of offensive touchdowns per game or not. And actually, there's a lot of iterations that predict touchdowns per game better than previous season touchdowns per game. And so if you're looking at the market from that perspective, and you see that Seattle has this trio of pass catchers that are going fairly early, top 36, top 40 wide receivers, that's good news for that offense. I think that, Alfredo nailed it when saying that if you are going to opt to not go for these guys, which is reasonable. Obviously there's a lot of ambiguity here. Geno Smith is the obvious value on that team. I mean, he's going a lot of times you can get him at like QB 14, QB 15, and he's got these pass catchers that are going so early. That's generally a sign that a guy's going to exceed ADP expectation. We saw that like with Alex Smith back when he was the Chiefs quarterback, the one year that he broke out, is a very, very, or Jay Cutler even, when he had Brandon Marshall and Alshon Jeffrey, when they were going early and Cutler was going really late, but why was he going so late? And then he ended up being a decent fantasy asset. So I really do like the call out of Geno Smith, but this is one of those situations too, where we can't ignore the variance of football. And what I mean by that is as the season goes on, there's a chance that one of these guys gets hurt, right? And there's going to end up being a clearer path to these guys seeing a 25%, an elite target share, because all of these guys are very, very good wide receivers. And so, yeah, I'm not saying like, bet on Jaxon Smith-Njigba because Tyler Lockett's going to get hurt, or bet on Tyler Lockett because JSN's going to get hurt. But I'm saying that's part of their range of outcome here. And it's nice that there are 2 other players that can really impact that instead of one, for them to really elevate their fantasy production. So I'm in the camp that I'm drafting these guys. I'm not getting them both on the same team or anything like that. But I think that they're both values, and I like them both more than drafting DK Metcalf in the 3rd round.
Yeah, so to sum it up, I mean, just bet on the talent, and all of these players are talented, and situations can change often. You talk about injuries, but also we've heard rumors for years now about Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf both being on the trade block. So if JSN comes out and is immediately playing at a high NFL level, it's more likely that one of those guys does get traded in season. So really, all these guys are good bets, but I think, again, Alfredo, I don't know how many times we've talked about it this offseason, but yeah, buy Geno is what we keep saying. That's the guy you want to draft more than anybody here. You can focus on the last few weeks when you saw a dip in efficiency, whatever it may be. But at the end of the day, Geno is the real winner here, especially with them bringing in Charbonnet to what was already a pretty good backfield. It's going to be a fun high-flying offense in Seattle. I want to talk about one more wide receiver situation here, and this is another one. They aren't all going inside the top 40, but Quentin Johnston is just outside at wide receiver 42. Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, though, are the ones that I think that we should focus on here. Keenan Allen's getting drafted as wide receiver 19, Mike Williams drafted as wide receiver 24, and then, like I said, we've also got Quentin Johnston on the outskirts at wide receiver 42. JJ, start us off here. Between these two guys, is there one that you prefer over the other, or is this a situation where you're kind of passing on both and waiting for the rookie?
So I really like the Chargers offense this year, with Kellen Moore going over there. And I think that this one actually is probably the most clear cut for me of the situations that we're analyzing on wide receiver, because I'm in on the Keenan Allen pick here. There's not a huge gap in terms of positional rank between these two guys. And I know that he's getting up there in age, and that's going to affect the way that people are viewing things, but Mike Williams kind of is too. I mean, it's not like Mike Williams is 23 or 24 years old. Obviously, Williams has had his issues throughout his career staying healthy. But Keenan Allen last year, yeah, he wasn't healthy throughout last year, but when he played, he saw over 23% of their targets per game. It's going to be an offense that probably plays a little bit more up-tempo, throws the ball down the field a little bit more. That ADOT's probably going to be a little bit better. But then on top of that, they're going to be probably more of a pass-heavy team. And so all of that combined, if he continues and maintains that 23% target share, that's going to be a lot of volume for Keenan Allen if he's healthy. And then if you look at his peripheral numbers, some more of his peripheral numbers, he didn't really see a drop-off. I mean, his yards per route run was still in line with what he's seen historically. There's really no reason to believe that Keenan Allen is ready to just tank, right? And then you mentioned Quentin Johnston. Him as a prospect, obviously more of a perimeter guy, or can play the perimeter. They're going to throw him on the perimeter, stretch the field a lot. Keenan Allen playing 64% of his, or running 64% of his routes last year from the slot. I think he'll be there, maybe even more permanently this year with Johnson, because they haven't had that true, third guy in that offense for so long. They've been trying to, but they just haven't been able to get him. And then, so I think that Quentin Johnston is much more of a threat to Mike Williams than he is to Keenan Allen. I think Allen has a locked-in role in that offense. He's going to be on the field in both 2 wide receiver and 3 wide receiver sets. And in those 3 wide receiver sets, if they're looking to the perimeter, they're going to look to either one of those guys, whereas the slot is going to be all Keenan Allen. So I'm very confident, in Keenan Allen's floor and ceiling, really, within this offense. I'm not super concerned about his age at this point. So I'm going to go Keenan Allen over Mike Williams here.
So I don't disagree with you, but you were very quick to just kind of dismiss Keenan Allen's age. And you look a lot at historical trends. Typically, I mean, he's 31 years old now, and obviously not getting any younger. And we usually don't see wide receivers still producing at an elite level there. I just saw this recently, actually. We've only seen, since 2019, we've only seen one wide receiver over the age of 30 with the top 24 finish, and that was 2019 Julian Edelman. So we're seeing a lot of these guys now, Devontae Adams, Keenan Allen, getting up there in age. Just curious, for somebody who spent so much time looking at historical data, why you're so quick to just dismiss the fact that he's 31, especially when we saw injuries last year starting to catch up to him a little bit. Is that really the only thing that would throw you off, would be potential injuries? You think that if he's healthy, he'll just still be the same Keenan Allen?
Yeah, look, the other thing too, yes, but I also think the other thing with a guy like Allen, that archetype tends to be able to, like you mentioned Julian Edelman as the one player that sort of bucked that trend. Julian Edelman was a route running machine, right? And that's exactly what Keenan Allen, that's his game. That is what he does. He's never been fast. He's never been physical. It's usually the physical guys that I'm more concerned about. It's the guys like Des Bryant hitting that wall, or Kenny Golladay even hitting that wall, and they usually hit that wall earlier. And then a player like Keenan Allen, he's already done what he did last season, from a yards per route run perspective and such, at a fairly old age. So he's already becoming sort of semi-outlier-esque. It's sort of like a Larry Fitzgerald type situation where they moved him to the slot more permanently down the stretch through the end of his career. And he was still fairly fantasy relevant until finally the market caught up. So I think given the fact that the market is showing us what it's showing us, that he's ranked where he's being ranked, Larry Fitzgerald's final season, he was still like a 9th, 10th round pick or whatever. But you could start to see him trail off a little bit in terms of the way that the masses and the public were viewing him. I just don't see that right now with Keenan Allen. Maybe it comes next year. But I still have faith, just given his archetype and the way that he plays football. I still have faith in him.
And everything you just said about Keenan Allen, just rewind this show 12 minutes and apply that to Tyler Lockett as well, because he's also getting up there in age, but the same exact, just a technician as a route runner, great at avoiding contact, going down before he takes that big hit. So Tyler Lockett's another guy that is technically over that scary age of 30, but his play style should bode well for an extended career. So Alfredo, back to Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. I saw you nodding along a lot with everything JJ was saying, so I don't think you're going to disagree with him here, but let's hear why you prefer Keenan Allen over Mike Williams.
Yeah, I echo a lot of the same sentiments from JJ. I'm going to try not to repeat a lot of the same stuff, but to me, this is just a much easier matchup looking at the two of them, one versus the other. I mean, Mike Williams has finished as a top 30 wide receiver once in the last 4 seasons, even if you account and change it to half PPR for a guy who doesn't catch, a high volume of targets. Where Keenan Allen, he's been a top 14 wide receiver in 5 of the last 6 seasons. So yeah, unless we expect a really sharp drop off or some sort of crazy injury that we can't predict, he's a guy that's probably going to return value on what his average draft cost is. Whereas Mike Williams almost seems to have never done that. He consistently gets drafted as a wide receiver too, and rarely ever returns that kind of value to you. JJ mentioned the addition of Quentin Johnson. And yeah, that does hurt Mike Williams a bit more than it does Keenan Allen. And we've already seen what a slot wide receiver, which is where Keenan Allen's going to play, what that looks like in a Kellen Moore-based offense. They took CeeDee Lamb and put him in the slot. And you talk about CeeDee Lamb getting 156 targets last year. And he's been doing that throughout his career in the slot there in Dallas. And then Keenan Allen's been doing the same. He's been anywhere from 136 to 157 targets over the last 4 or 5 years. So yeah, I think it's very reasonable to believe that Keenan Allen continues to get a high volume role in this offense, an offense that's going to pass more, an offense that, like JJ mentioned, is going to pass a bit further downfield. So now those targets become even a little bit more valuable. There's probably going to be a bit more points too. So, you could still see some scoring opportunities for Keenan Allen. Just a fun thing that I saw on Twitter yesterday, I can't remember who said it. I wish I could give the credit, but last year from week 11 on, Keenan Allen was the wide receiver 3 in fantasy points per game. So, it kind of goes back to, we always think of these high volume guys as being such a safe floor, but he kind of displayed there's a pretty good ceiling there for quite a bit of time as the season went on. And it's sort of the opposite of what JJ said, how rookies get better as the season goes on. We're seeing an old dude who was dealing with injuries that looked better as the season went on. So I think that, if you're looking for some solace that the age may not catch up with him, I think that's it right there.
And I think another important piece of context here is, again, we talked about it earlier, that we're using underdog rankings here. So right now, Mike Williams getting drafted at wide receiver 24 on underdog. Realistically, he's probably not going to go that high when you're drafting in your home league, because he's not a guy you want to draft as your wide receiver 2 and confidently plug in every single week. But in best ball and in these big underdog tournaments where the spike weeks are so important, you could still get that random 120-yard, 2-touchdown game from Mike Williams. But after we just talked about how bad we are at projecting floor and ceiling, I'm going to go ahead and say it. Mike Williams does not have a safe floor whatsoever. He doesn't draw the targets at that rate that make him a safe option. So he is, as cliche as it sounds, one of those guys that is much more valuable in best ball than he is in your standard fantasy football league. If you were tuning into this show hoping for us to say this is the guy that you definitively need to draft in these situations, you're not going to get that, because a lot of these are very ambiguous and muddy situations. But we did our best today to try to explain how we feel about these players and hopefully give you the information you need to make an informed and good decision when you're on the clock in your fantasy drafts. One more time, just want to thank you guys for coming on today. Before we sign off, though, JJ, let everyone know where they can find you. Patreon, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, whatever you want to plug, the floor is yours.
Yeah, you can check out all my work over on lateround.com. I got the draft guide coming out next week. I'm very pumped about that. Patreon, podcast, free newsletter, and then I'm on Twitter at LateRoundQB.
Yeah, one of the best follows on Twitter. Cannot wait for your in-season data dumps. I look forward to those. They come out Sunday nights, right?
Yes, I tried to at least, yeah.
Yeah, so definitely check those out at LateRoundQB, one of the best follows in the industry. And then Alfredo, one more time, let everyone know where they can find you.
Yeah, I won't make my usual MySpace joke about finding me there, but you can find all my work here at Football Guys. You're usually going to see my face or Dave's face all over our YouTube channel. I've got my show, The Pretend GM, that airs weekly, and then you can find me on Twitter at The Pretend GM.
Yeah, and if you're not finding Alfredo on the launch pad, you're probably going to find me on the Pretend GM. We've been doing a lot together this offseason. Always a blast chopping it up with you, buddy. But you can find me on Twitter at Dave Kluge. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with Alfredo, JJ, and I today as we talked about some ambiguous teammate situations. Over on the right side of your screen, you're going to see some other videos that we have here at youtube.com/footballguys, as well as a button to click so you can subscribe to check out all of our content. Thank you so much for tuning in.